Chapter 15. Pat went back into the house while Sam raced the corral to throw harness on a team of his fastest horses and hooked them to the buckboard. Doc Trimble was sitting in the living room rocking back and forth while he puffed on his gurgling pipe. "I gotta get Ezra into jail in Dutch Springs," Pat told the doctor, "and I reckon I'll need Sam in there a little later to help out. Will you be needing either of us here? Sally should be right along quick, I suppose," he added hastily. "Can you and her make out all right?" Trimble took the pipe out of his mouth and chuckled.
"God bless you, Pat Stevens. If you can arrange some way to get Sam out from underfoot tonight. I've never lost a father in this business, but I never know when I'm gonna."
"You'll have to help me with it," Pat warned him. "Sam won't take my word for it that he ain't needed. I'll tell him how bad I need him in town, and then when Sally gets here, maybe you can run him off."
"Why, you just leave it to me," the old doctor said grimly. "I'll get rid of him if I have to chase him off with his own gun. So you're taking Ezra into jail, eh, Pat?"
Trimble mused with a troubled glance at the unconscious figure on the floor. "That's right. He ought to be safest there." Pat paused and frowned over his uneasy thoughts. "You know Ezra pretty good, Doc. What do you think about these things they're telling on him? You ever see any signs that he might turn off crazy like that?"
"Turn into a homicidal maniac?" scoffed Doc Trimble. "Not Ezra. He hasn't the sort of brain that turns crazy, Pat, and I mean that for a scientific fact," he went on with earnest. "He's easy-going and quiet, and not too bright. He just ain't the type to go around murdering women and children."
Pat drew in a long breath of relief. "Well, that's the way that me and Sam figured it too, but I'm glad to hear you'd back us up on that." Sam came busting into the door just then.
"Got the buckboard hooked up. Can you help me load him in, Pat?"
The doc got up and said good-naturedly,
"I've got two good arms. You take the heavy part in the front, and I'll take his feet, Sam. You rest that shoulder of yours, Pat."
Pat went past them and held the door open while they staggered out under the dead weight of Ezra's 250 pounds. They loaded him into the back of the buckboard with some difficulty, and then Trimble trotted back into the house.
"You reckon you can handle things in town?"
Sam asked anxiously as Pat gathered up the reins.
"Folks are mighty bent on stringing Ezra up without even a trial."
"I doubt there'll be many of them around town by the time I get there. I'll get him into the jail all right, but there's liable to be bad trouble later when the posse starts drifting in and word gets around where he is. That's when I'll need you and your guns," he went on sharply. "I'll be riding out to Pinky Wright's place. Soon as Sally gets over here, help the doc, and you'll better ride in and be ready to take over."
I don't know about that," muttered Sam. "It seems I ought to stay close by Kitty. I don't reckon Doc Trimble would like me riding off and leaving him."
"You can't do nothing for Kitty. Lots better if you got something to keep your mind off of it." Pat climbed up into the front seat of the buckboard. "I'm going to be trusting you to be in town to see that nothing happens to Ezra while I'm out at Pinky's." He shook the lines and whooped at the half-wild team before Sam could offer any objections. The buckboard lurched away, and Pat guided them into the Dutch Springs road with one hand, and then settled back and gave them their heads. It was quite dark, and lights were beginning to show in Dutch Springs half an hour later when the buckboard neared the town. The broncs were tired after their mad gallop, and Pat easily slowed them to a sedative trot, swinging them off the main road and making a circle to come up unobserved at the back of Mr. Winter's general store. He jumped out and looped the reins under a front hub, and then knotted them to a spoke so any forward movement would tighten the lines and automatically draw the team back. Then he hurried in through the back door, of the dark storeroom in the back of the store. A gleam of light showed in from the front of the store, and Pat threaded his way forward between rows of packing cases to a point where he could peer out and see Mr. Winters behind the meat counter waiting on a late customer. Miss Willis was buying some salt pork and insisting that the storekeeper cut off a piece from the lean end. Mr. Winters was grumbling about it while he explained that his other customers took the fat along with the lean, but Miss Wilson was adamant, and her Henry wouldn't eat no fat pork, she told him, and he ought to know it as well as she by this time. Pat stayed back out of sight and waited impatiently until the transaction was completed. The moment Miss Wilsis was out the door, he leaned forward and said, "Psst," loudly. Mr. Winters jumped a foot in the air. He dropped a side of salt pork onto the sawdust-covered floor and whirled about. The anger faded from his face and was replaced by worry when he recognized Pat staring out at him. He hurried around the counter and exclaimed, "You shouldn't be here, Pat. Not until they find Ezra. The whole valley's blaming you for what happened last night." "Lock up the front door," Pat Stevens told him tensely. "Quick, before any more customers come in. Don't stand there looking at me. I'm in bad trouble and I need help." After a long searching glance at Pat's troubled face and his wounded condition, Mr. Winters nodded and trotted to the front door. He barred it on the inside and blew out the lamp up front, and then came loping back and took down the lamp from the meat counter. "We best get into the back room, where nobody can see a light from the front." He followed Pat back and put a door so that it was shut and that the light wouldn't shine out. "Now what?" he said severely. "What kind of doings is this, Pat? Who shot you up like this, and where's Ezra? We gotta get a hold of him before he kills everybody else." "Ezra hasn't killed anybody," Pat snapped. "He ain't gonna kill anyone if you'll help me. You got a gun around here?"
"There's lots in the showcase out front, and I've got a double-barrel shotgun, but what do you mean about Ezra, Pat? Everybody knows."
"Everybody's crazy," Pat grumbled. "I got Ezra out back in Sam's buckboard. He's unconscious, and Doc Trimble says he won't come to for a few hours. And there's no time for explanations. You gotta trust me and help me. All I want is to get Ezra locked up safe in jail where someone will guard him there so he can't get away again and there won't be any lynching party. Not until I get back. Is that too much to ask?"
"Why, no, I guess not," said Winters. "But if you got him, Pat—"
"We're wasting time," Pat interrupted. "Think you can round up 2 or 3 men that still trust Pat Stevens enough to stand guard with you over Ezra while I go after the real killer?"
"Yeah, I'll go into the Gold Eagle and see who's there."
Pat's crisp tone of authority reassured the storekeeper. "Don't let on what you want to the others in the Gold Eagle," Pat warned him. "The fewer that know Ezra's in jail, the better. I don't want any riots or shooting while I'm gone."
"I'll go out the back way. You stay right here until I get back."
The storekeeper hurried out, and Pat moved back and sat down with a sigh of weariness on a wooden box. He hadn't realized how tired he was, and hungry too. He hadn't eaten a bite since supper the night before. It seemed like days or weeks ago. It was difficult to realize it was only a little more than 24 hours before when he and Ezra were sitting at the supper table at the Lazy Mare. He got up and searched about until he found an open cracker barrel, and he got out a huge handful of dry crackers and began munching on them, and then found a keg of apple cider resting on 2 wooden sawhorses with a wooden faucet for drawing off jugs of cider. He couldn't find any cup or glass, but there was an empty jug on the floor, and he ran that half full and carried it back to the cracker barrel. He washed down the dry crackers with sips of cider and wished Winters would hurry back. He was afraid that there wasn't much time. He had to get out to Pinky Wright's ranch before there was another fatality. He didn't think Pinky knew the full extent of the danger he was in. Pinky was sort of a happy-go-lucky fella without an ounce of fear in his makeup, but fearlessness wouldn't stop a cowardly bullet coming out of the night without warning. Pat jumped to his feet and hurried to the back door when he heard voices outside. Mr. Winters was there, with John Boyd and Vernon Pike. Vernon ran a little freighting business that hauled supplies into Dutch Springs from the railroad line in Hopewell Junction, and he was a solid, dependable sort of man. John Boyd said,
"Howdy, Pat. What's this here stuff that Winter's been telling us about Ezra?"
"He's right here in Sam's buckboard. I want to drive him round to the jail and put him in without anyone knowing about it, and I want you three to see that he doesn't get out."
"Just wait until I get my shotgun,"
Winters interjected, and then he hurried inside. "What's it all about?" Boyd persisted. "If what they say about Ezra's true, why do we waste time locking him up?" "It's not true, and I'm going to be proving it," snapped Pat. "If I can't prove him innocent, you boys have him right there in jail. Isn't that fair enough?"
"I guess it sounds all right," Boyd agreed doubtfully, but we're liable to have trouble when it spreads around that he's there. The boys are mighty riled up about all the killings last night."
"That'll be up to you," Pat told them. "I hope I won't be gone too long, and Sam will be in soon to help you out." Mr. Winters came out with his sawed-out shotgun, and Pat led the way to the buckboard. "You and Vernon walk out ahead to the corner and see if it's clear," he told John Boyd. "Winters and I will follow along slowly." The tall rancher and the manager of the freighting business went on towards the end of the alley. Pat untied the lines from the wheel, and Winters gave him a hand up into the seat. Then the storekeeper climbed up beside him and rested his murderous weapon across his knees. Pat chuckled at the expression on Winter's face as he clucked to the team. "I never thought I'd see you mixed up in anything illegal."
"Well, it's kind of catching," Winters told him solemnly. "Last night I did my best to help Ezra break out of jail, but you already beat us to it. Now I find myself trying to sneak him back behind bars."
He sighed loudly and complained,
"And I'll be dogged if I know what any of it's even about. Everything's topsy-turvy. Last night John and I was hating your guts, and tonight we're taking orders from you. I sure hope you know what you're doing this time."
As do I. Pat pulled up the team at the end of the alley. In the moonlight he could see Boyd and Vernon Pike sauntering across towards the jail in front of them. No one else was in sight from this back street. Pat let the team out at a cautious walk and followed the advanced guard slowly. He didn't have any idea where Trippo or any of his deputies were. He could only hope they weren't headquartered at the sheriff's office behind the jail. If there were, there would likely be some shooting before Ezra was safely behind bars. And if it became known too soon that Ezra was locked up, that would spoil his hopes as well. He was pinning everything on the assumption that Eustace Arlo thought that Ezra was still at large and would be accused of any other crimes that were committed that night. For Pat was beginning to sense the outline of a horrible plan that was behind everything that had happened since the preceding night. A diabolical, monstrous plot that offered the most plausible explanation for all the seemingly unrelated incidences of the night. Yet, though Pat felt he knew the answer, he had to have proof. His theory was too fantastic to hope anyone would listen to him without irrefutable proof. Right now, the whole valley was aroused to the madness of a bloodlust against Ezra, and it was going to take a lot of proving to turn their anger away from the big one-eyed man. If he could get Ezra safely into jail, with only these three trusted friends aware of the maneuver, Pat felt he had a good chance to catch the real villain red-handed when he tried to murder Pinky Wright. For if Pinky's theory was correct, Pinky would have to die, and quickly, before he could go around spreading his assertion that Ethan Page had never actually signed the mortgage that Harlow held on his ranch. That was a break that Pat hadn't bargained for. Until the moment of Pinky's chance to stop off at Sam's, Pat hadn't really seen any way out of the tangle through which he was already dimmingly sensing the truth. But it hadn't made much sense until he realized that Ethan Page's signature must have been forged on the mortgage. And then the entire plot became damnable clear. He began to see that one man had motive for all 4 seemingly unrelated murders, when in the beginning it had seemed that Harlow had profited only by one of them. Pat wasn't sure yet just how much Pinky understood about the whole setup. He didn't know whether Pinky realized he was deliberately asked to be murdered when he sent the VX ranch hand right into Harlow with his story about knowing about Ethan Page having changed his mind about borrowing money from Harlow. But he thought Pinky did suspect what the probable consequence would be. Now it was up to him to get out to Pinky Wright's ranch before the inevitable could happen. Pat slapped the team of broncs into a trot as they rounded a turn, and he saw the jail and the sheriff's office laying dark and deserted behind the courthouse. Vernon Pike and Boyd had already reached the jail when Pat drove up. "It's all right," Boyd told him gruffly. "Not a soul around anywhere. The jail door's standing open just like you left it after you took Ezra out last night." It required too much effort, and it would have taken much too long for Pat to try and explain to them that it wasn't even him who released Ezra. There'd be plenty of time for such explanation later. So he simply said, "Drag him out of the back and stick him inside. All 3 of you swear that you'll stand on guard and see that he doesn't get away if he comes to. Maybe you'd better tie him up while he's unconscious just in case, since you haven't got any key."
"Didn't you keep the key after you unlocked the door last night?"
Vernon Pike asked in astonishment, while he and Boyd rolled the heavy body of Ezra out of the buckboard. "Must have got lost," Pat said. "I'm trusting you to stay here and keep watch," he added in a low tone to Winters.
"Where are you going, Pat? Where are you in such a hurry to? You better tell me."
"There's no time for talking now." Pat glanced over his shoulder and saw that Boyd and Pike were dragging Ezra inside the dark jail. He braced his feet against the dashboard and shouted at the team. Rested from their hard run-in from the express station, the team bolted away from the jail, and Pat headed them straight southward from town toward Pinky Wright's ranch. End of chapter 15.